The Vigilance Committee was a group formed in 1851 in San Francisco in order to combat the rise of gangs that were infiltrating the city, one of the most well-known and common being the Sydney Ducks, who were a group of criminals from Australia. They formed because most of the people who were running San Francisco were corrupt and were often being paid off in order to ensure that no one was ever punished or put in jail or anything like that. So the Vigilance Committee formed, and they actually committed quite a few executions of various Sydney Duck members or people who ultimately just committed crimes that would have never been punished for anyway. So this goes to show that San Francisco in the beginning was a town full of unrest. There was no real police force, and it was really run by criminals. So the majority of the people there relied on a force to combat the criminal behavior that was occurring, and ultimately disbanded twice in 1851 and then was recreated again in 1856 and then disbanded again. And after that, all the officials in the city basically just knew that if things were to continue on as they were, that the Vigilance Committee would come back and ultimately stop any misdeeds or anything that was going unpunished.
The occupation of Alcatraz, starting on November 20th, 1969, was the third and final occupation of Alcatraz to happen in the 1960s. This occupation is the most well-known because of its length. It was 19 months long and ended on June 10th of 1971. There was a lot of turmoil leading up to this occupation, such as hundreds of years of mistreatment of Native Americans and Indigenous people in the United States. This involved broken treaties, stolen land, promised property, and just horrible things that happened along the way. But the biggest factor in all of this was the indigenous urbanization movement that happened right before this. The United States government told Native Americans who lived on reservations that if they moved off the reservations and started urbanizing, they would get a little bit of money, they would put them in programs that would get them to jobs, they'd give them housing, and they'd start giving them a better life in these cities. But when these Native American populations started getting into these programs, they realized the money that they were promised stopped before these job programs started. These job programs usually did not lead to a job, or it led to a very low income job, and this housing was very low income skid row housing. So it led them a few possibilities. So this led to a lot of coalitions that ended up in these large urban areas. And one of these areas was the Bay Area. This led to a lot of different organizations built by indigenous and native populations in these areas, and led to a very bound and tightly wound community of people from all different tribes, not just tribes that were in this area, but tribes from all over the country.
Black Panther Party is a Black Power organization founded in 1966 in Oakland by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton. After its inception, the party created a 10-point program detailing their hopes and demands. Quickly after their formation, they were labeled as quite militant, as one of the first issues they zeroed in on was police brutality. In order to combat this, they set up armed neighborhood watches and police patrols in order to make sure when the police did come through these communities, they did not harass or brutalize anyone. After the incarceration of Huey P. Newton in 1968, and a lot of internal strife in the party, mostly due to FBI informants, the party had to change platforms, and so they opted to do more community service work. Some of the programs they set up include free food. They had multiple free breakfast and free lunch programs. They also helped set up medical clinics in order to give their communities access to better health care, in order to combat medical racism at this time. They also set up a lot of educational programs in order to further educate and empower people of color in their communities.
The city of San Francisco has been shaped by many progressive movements that have made it the city it has become today. One of those movements is the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. In the beginning of the 1980s, there was a disease that was found in metropolitan areas among gay men, immigrants, and injection users that was known as AIDS. Due to the stigma that these certain groups had faced, there was outbreak, and it was difficult for government organizations to release or help these people what they needed to get better. Therefore, many grassroots organizations began in San Francisco, such as ACT UP and the Walk Against AIDS. And the LGBTQ community, not necessarily in the wake of the death of Harvey Milk, but because the gay community was affected so heavily by the impact of AIDS, they grouped up and they were helping together. Another impact that was that I mentioned before was the death of Harvey Milk. He was the first openly gay elected official to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, and his impact on what he wanted to push as a leader, and also his death had an impact on the AIDS epidemic due to his role in the gay community and how he wanted to push that. Due to the stigma faced by the disease, a lot of the men that had been affected by the disease who did not know their death time were left alone by some of their lovers, some of their family, because it was one of those things that you never knew. And so a Castro district in which major impact in the district, the Castro district is a location in San Francisco where many of these individuals live. And so it's interesting to see the correlation between how 30 years, 40 years later, we still see people are stigmatized against this certain disease, even after so much time has passed. One event that has caused this, that has been the marker of this, is government action, because at a certain point, their Social Security or their retirement funds, or they don't have enough money to get the correct medication, or on the flip side of that, the medication that they are taking is deteriorating other systems in their body. So the effect of AIDS is that the effect that AIDS has had on the San Francisco community has been very great. The impact that Harvey Milk had on the LGBTQ community, and as well as what that led to in the AIDS epidemic, and the political aftermath, and the grassroots organizations and the community organization that occurred after the time really helped shape how the AIDS epidemic and how we see epidemics to this day, how they're affected, and how that community organization makes extremely important.
The Third World Liberation Front was created to remedy the lack of representation of ethnic groups in the curriculum at UC Berkeley. From the climate of social unrest, specifically with the Chicano and the Black Panther movement, we can see that these had a substantial impact on the front and their path to achieve their intended goals. The Third World Liberation Front was initiated in 1968 and was formed by Native American, Chicano and Latino, Chinese, Filipino American, as well as the Black Student Union students. The Front's goals was for more ethnic studies and diversity to be integrated within their higher education at UC Berkeley, and as well made a list of demands pursuing these goals. Members of the Third World Liberation Front demanded courses to emphasize the experiences of people of color. Undoubtedly, as the strike took place, the members of the Third World Liberation Front were met with clouds of tear gas and violence as a response of the police department. After the 5-month-long strike, on March 20th, 1969, the strike came to an end after negotiations with the administration of UC Berkeley, which ended with UC Berkeley agreeing to accept virtually all non-white applicants for the fall of 1969 semester, and to establish a College of Ethnic Studies, which would be the first in the country to do so, with classes geared towards communities of color. Their civil disobedience not only impacted the people of the Bay Area, but continued to leave their imprint in the 21st century as students and others continued to fight for change.